Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss a disturbing report that's come out. According to the 2020 Global Terrorism Index from the Institute for Economics and Peace, over the past 5 years, far-right terror attacks across Western countries, and we're talking about specifically North America, Western Europe, and Oceania, have increased by around 250%. This, of course, is still the macro issue of terrorism has in fact declined across the world. Nevertheless, the far right is very quickly rising, as we can tell through these statistics. What does this then mean? I mean, in the U.S., there's also, interestingly, statistics that say that around 40% of those who were surveyed felt that violence for political ends was at least partially justifiable. And of course, all of that comes in the context of an election which has been hard-fought and controversial, to say the very least, with Donald Trump still very much not actually conceding officially at this point in time to Joe Biden. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined firstly by Bjorn Ihler, who is the co-founder and executive director of the Khalifa Ihler Institute. He's joining us today from Oslo. Joining us this evening from Sydney is Steve Killelea, who is the founder and executive chairman of the Institute for Economics and Peace. Steve and Bjorn, thank you both for joining us here in Scope. Bjorn, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of these statistics? 250% an increase over 5 years is quite drastic, isn't it?
It is. I think, as you point out, it's worth recognizing the fact that international terrorism has gone down by 15% over the last year, while statistically also there has been a drastic increase of far-right extremism. And that is consistent with what we have seen at the Khalifa Ihler Institute and what we have mapped in our hate map, where we are keeping track of the global trends of far-right extremism. And this is a worrying trend and something that we need to recognize and take seriously, and of course do everything we can in order to work against.
So why are we seeing this in? Because we've almost had the likes of Donald Trump in office in the United States. We've had likes of Boris Johnson in the UK. Is it all down to the politicians, or is there more behind this? Or is the economy behind this, for example? Because a lot of people are pointing to that, especially within the context of the pandemic.
So there are complex reasons for this. There's complex dynamics going on behind why these things are happening. Of course, we can track things back to the economy. We can see that there was a global change around 2007, 2008 in far-right extremism around the time of the global financial crisis back then. And we've seen that evolve over the last decade. But we've also seen that in light of internet usage among extremist groups, the internet being central in recruitment, among others, to far-right organizations such as Proud Boys and QAnon and other conspiracy theories. We've seen this also reflected in kind of the fabric of reality being torn apart in the contest surrounding fake news and various perceptions of reality. And that's also something that's reflected into mainstream politics, where we see things like President Donald Trump, of course, contesting even the institutions of democracy in the U.S., and that being a factor playing into the election right now, but also into the growth of the far right in the U.S. And so there's plenty of complex dynamics around this. Some of that is also the global war on terror post 9/11 that, of course, has created an ecosystem for widespread fear against Islam and radical Islamism across Europe and the West. And that also in light of the migration wave following the civil wars and unrest following 2011 has added to that in many ways. And, in some ways, you can also see it as a response to the widespread fear and rhetoric surrounding ISIS and other terrorist organizations.
Steve, if you can hear me, tell us about this report that your organization has come out with, and I know that this comes out on a yearly basis, but it's disturbing certainly that you've been observing this very drastic increase in far-right terror attacks across the world. As I was discussing the word Bjorn, what do you make of what the causes behind this may be?
Well, I think if we're looking at it, first off I'd say is that it is alarming, a 250% increase in deaths attributed to the far right, but it is coming off a low base. So the odd 13,000 deaths last year through terrorism, 81 of them were caused by the far right. Now, it's very hard to sort of pin exact causes. Most of the individuals aren't associated with an organised group. They're what we would call lone wolves, so they're operating on their own. But a lot of the time they're ultra-nationalists, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, people along those following those kind of belief systems, and they self-radicalise over the internet.
So talk about the internet then, because that's been an important area of discussion, hasn't it, Steve, for a while now, where there's been this realization that we have all these Facebook groups, we have the dark web as well, which allows for the spread of these ideologies. How important a discussion then is that vis-a-vis policing the internet? Because then we entered then into a very gray area there too, don't we?
More broadly, if we look at it, this is happening globally. The level of disinformation has been rising steadily now for over the last decade. And so I think there's a need for certainly the radicalisation, whether it's Islamic or whether it's far right over the internet, needs to be addressed. This brings us into a broader discussion on disinformation generally on the internet and how to tackle that. And what we need is coordinated efforts globally to be able to ascertain and understand what are the really bad internet players and working out ways of being able to shut them down.
So Bjorn, on that topic of the internet, I know we've spoken about this before with you as well. How does one now come to a realistic or reasonable way of dealing with that? Because then there's so many issues then of censorship, right? I mean, it's not as simple as just saying, okay, we're going to shut down all far-right groups, or maybe is it that simple?
I mean, it's more complex than simply shutting down the far right. As we've seen, when taking down content, groups have a tendency to merge and move on to new platforms. We're seeing an increase in kind of the use of fringe network and sort of underground platforms in response to takedowns by larger corporations such as Facebook and Twitter. In the meantime, there has been a response developed by Facebook, Twitter, Google, and Microsoft in establishing the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, for which I'm chairing the Independent Advisory Committee. And we are seeing that these companies taking action actually matters in changing perspectives and changing what is allowed to exist within the public spheres in which we all exist, and that has an impact on things like recruitment to these groups and these theories, as most of us don't necessarily operate in the more hidden networks. And so there are different sides and different effects that has, and we are really kind of in the early stages of understanding those dynamics, understanding what that does to radicalization as a whole, and whether it actually pushes people further into extremist groups when they're being pushed off of the mainstream online platforms. And so the jury is still out in many ways, but a lot of effort is being put into this. A lot of governance questions are being asked at the international level through a multi-stakeholder approach, and I'm hopeful for the future of internet governance when it comes to these issues.
Steve, the final word on this issue then of how exactly one approaches this, right? I mean, I imagine education is also a key factor, but then there's also this huge other factor, right, of where I know in Europe and even in North America, there's this feeling that minorities are taking over, right? So those who migrated even generations ago, that those people of color, essentially, if I may, phrase them all into that one category, are essentially going to become the majority in the not so distant future. How does one deal with both education and second, that feeling of becoming a minority in your own country?
I think we need to take one step further back. And so if we look at the kind of people who are committing acts of terror, certainly in the West, what we find is they're usually people who are alienated or in some other ways disfranchised from society as a whole. If we take another step back, what we find is in most of the Western democracies, there's a number of factors which are negative factors which are going on. And that'd be things like what we're seeing is, let's say, increases in group grievances. We're finding there's bigger inequality in wealth. We find that there's more disinformation, as I've already mentioned. We also find that the elites, fractionalised elites, are fighting more amongst themselves. This is epitomised, let's say, by Brexit or the US elections. And there's other things as well. And so these underlying fundamentals, if the societies can correct them, then they take away a lot of those factors which cause people to alienate in the first place.
Very well. Leave it at that as our final word, but we appreciate both Bjorn and Steve for their time today and for sharing their expert insight with us. Again, the Global Terrorism Index report, which comes out on a yearly basis from the Institute for Economics and Peace, has shown an alarming statistic, i.e. that within the past 5 years, far-right terror attacks have gone up by 250%, even though, as I put in my introduction as well, overall terrorism across the world has actually decreased. So that is certainly a good point, but then the worrying trend is that the far-right is rising at a very rapid rate. What does that mean? What are the root causes? How does one deal with this? Are governments acting fast enough to actually A, first admit that this is an issue, and B, deal with it head on? Have the lessons been learned from trying to deal with other forms of quote unquote terrorism? Has this been an underlying issue that governments have ignored for too long? And maybe it is their own fault that this has now gotten to this point. How does the world deal with this, and what then happens next vis-a-vis this issue? I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Iran-US relations. We've discussed that many, many times, of course, on this show. But President Rouhani of Iran has said that now that President-elect Joe Biden is set to be confirmed, hopefully fairly soon, and now that Donald Trump has spoken of the transition in a bit more detail and a bit more positive terms as well, seemingly, that Rouhani feels that the Biden administration can, once it comes into office, possibly turn the clock and return things back to how they were before Trump came into office. Now, of course, that's not without fine print. Rouhani has said very clearly that that Joe Biden would need to apologize for what the Trump administration has done vis-a-vis the sanctions against Iran and, of course, the assassination of Soleimani. I imagine there's a lot of grievances that Iran has towards the U.S. and probably the other way around as well, ever since the U.S. decided to walk away from the JCPOA or the Iran nuclear deal. Now, is this a bit, if I may use the term naive of Rouhani to be saying at this time, considering so much has happened ever since the U.S. was walked away from the Iran nuclear deal? It's not like you can just snap things back and wish what's happened in the ensuing time to simply go away, and the many grievances that have grown on both sides about each other. Can we simply just revert back to the deal at this point in time? Is that even realistic and practical? Let's discuss that further. We're now joined by Dr. Farhang Jahanpour, who is a former professor and dean at the University of Isfahan. He's a former senior research scholar also at Harvard and has taught at Cambridge and Oxford universities. He's joining us today from Caversham in the UK. Joining us from Berlin, Germany is Dr. Hans Jacob Schindler, who is a former German security official who served at the German embassy in Tehran from the years 2005 to 2011. He also advises companies regarding sanctions on Iran. Hans Jacob and Farhang, thank you both for your time today and for joining us here in Scope. Farhang, I'd like to start with you. I know that maybe I'm being quite critical of Rouhani, but do you think that Rouhani may be being a bit too optimistic about what Biden can really do vis-a-vis the JCPOA?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. As you know very well, both Iran and the United States have a domestic audience, and both of them have hardliners and moderates. So I think part of what Mr. Rouhani and Mr. Zarif have been saying during the past few days has been really addressed to the domestic audience to try to see if they can move ahead and reach an agreement with the United States. I think what he said basically makes sense. Iran signed an agreement not only with the United States, but with all the 5 permanent members of the United Nations, plus Germany, and it was endorsed by the Security Council Resolution 2231 and by the EU. Therefore, Iran is on the right. Iran lived according to its obligations, but it was United States Trump who illegally withdrew from the accord and then imposed, contrary to the Resolution 2231, many crippling sanctions on Iran. So they are basically right that it is up to America to apologize and to return, but I think that is a bit optimistic. The best we can hope for is for both sides to return to the period before Trump took office.
Jacob, certainly the Europeans would like for the U.S. to come back into the fold of the deal, certainly. I mean, that's been expressed by the three foreign ministers, I believe, of France, Germany, and the UK, I believe, when they recently met or discussed. But do you think that's likely to happen? Can Biden come back into this? I mean, he said he would. If Iran were to also come back into the fold in the sense of, start again adhering to its obligations within the deal before the U.S. walked away. But I mean, it just seems like it's complicated on both sides, isn't it, by both domestic politics and foreign policies?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me as well. Look, we are looking forward to a long process here. This is not a quick reversal. And keep in mind, Trump is not done. He has at least a couple of weeks left, and as you have seen the last couple of weeks, he will do his utmost to ramp up the pressure on Iran and lock in as many sanctions and restrictions as he can in order to bind the new Biden administration on this path. Entangling all the various sanctions and the double and the triple sanctioning of certain entities within Iran is going to be very domestically costly. And depending on how the two Senate races in Georgia are going to pan out, i.e. whether the Democrats are able to control the Senate or whether they are not able to control the Senate, will dictate the pace of this process. On the other hand, don't forget, as soon as Biden is inaugurated, President Rouhani has only a couple of months before the presidential election. So his opposition within the country will also not really be eager to allow him a major foreign policy success for his camp just before the presidential election. So the European side are not expecting quick progress here, but at least with a new Biden administration, there is a new path to come to an agreement. I don't think there will ever be a return to the situation in 2018 simply because it's impossible. I cannot see that the Iranian side is willing to dismantle all the centrifuges that they, built up in the last couple of years, reduce the stockpile, and unlearn all of the research that they have done in the last couple of years. So it will be some kind of a new agreement. People talking about JCPOA plus, including a missile program, or JCPOA minus, i.e., back to the restrictions that the JCPOA put physically in place, which is the preference for the Europeans, but on a higher level of technology within it.
Farhang, as Hans Jacob there correctly said, soon after Biden is to come into office officially, we will then have, in the not too distant future after that, elections within Iran. And, there's already been talk about how Rouhani and, the more of the reformist camp has taken a beating because of what has happened vis-a-vis this deal. This then seems like we're just heading to a dead end in many ways, aren't we?
I'm not really sure. I think one of the greatest disservices of Trump administration was that it enabled the hardliners to sideline Rouhani and the moderates to say that you talked for 4 years with America and see what you got, nothing. And in fact, worse than before. Although Iran was on the way of coming towards the West, signing huge contracts with European and even American companies, and that would have been the best option to bring Iran into the Western fold and, in fact, engage her economically, politically, socially, and so on. The Trump administration has done its best to make sure that some of the sanctions cannot be removed. But I think the only hopeful sign is that most of them, of course, were not endorsed by Congress. Neither was JCPOA, by the way. They were executive orders. And I think, of course, President Biden, when he comes to office, he has many important and pressing issues on his agenda: COVID, economic situation, China, Russia, and many, many other issues. But I think the issue of Iran and the whole Persian Gulf and the Middle East is so important that I think it would be wise of him to give it priority. And I think what they could do to cancel, in the same way that Trump introduced those by executive order, simply to cancel and say that the United States is returning to the JCPOA, which means lifting the sanctions. And under those circumstances, I think it is wise of Iran also to return to where they were before the Trump administration.
Jacob, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. Let's hone in on Germany for a moment, just because you're there and you're an expert on that country as well. How do you think the Germans are feeling vis-a-vis the JCPOA right now? I mean, is it because the Europeans keep saying that, listen, we want the U.S. back into the fold, we want to preserve the deal, but again, as I said, a lot has happened ever since the U.S. walked away from the deal. Is it as simple as that for the Europeans as well?
No, it's not at all simple. I mean, first of all, as I said before, returning to the JCPOA requires both sides to return to the JCPOA, and I have my doubts whether Iran is fully willing or able to really go back to the amount of technology they had in 2018. On the German side, of course, there are, a couple of additional grievances. There have never been as many dual German-Iranian nationals in prison in Iran than there are right now, despite, and we have talked about this over the years together, you and me, many attempts by the German government to try to preserve the JCPOA. It was instrumental in setting up INSTEX. It was instrumental in setting up the blocking statute within the European Union, only to be met by, what cannot be otherwise interpreted as contempt in Iran. So we have a path back, but it's going to be a very long process and with very, slow progress at best. But at least there is now a path to a more sensible way to approach this subject.
All right, we thank now Farhang and Hans Jacob for their time. And Farhang, they're speaking to us from Caversham in the UK. Hans Jacob was speaking to us from Berlin. Now we're going to cross over to Reza Khanzedah, who is joining us from Washington, D.C. He's a research fellow at the Sharif University think tank. He's also a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford. We're also joined now from the Iranian capital, Tehran, by Habib Abdul Hussein, who is a commentator and journalist. Habib and Reza, thank you very much for joining us here in Scope. Reza, the issue of Iran-US relations and Rouhani essentially coming out with this fairly optimistic tone of the possibility of snapping back into a world before Donald Trump and before the U.S. walked away from the JCPOA. Is he being naive, do you think?
No, I don't. But at the same time, we need to look at all the key phrases or, bullet points, if you will, that we've heard from Rouhani, because he's also made comments, and not just him, but many within the Islamic Republic have made comments about compensation. One being perhaps the $5 billion that they requested from the IMF to battle COVID. But this talking point of compensation is what makes me believe that Rouhani and his administration are not naive. They have been showing signs of, willingness to work with the Biden administration, with Biden, and to see them kind of push back a little bit now, asking for counsel. Now, you do have Zarif, who doesn't toe the same line as the president of Iran. He says that within, I think he was quoted saying that with 3 executive orders, Biden can re-enter the, JCPOA, and so will Iran. So there is this kind of, balancing act within Iran where you have some like Rouhani pushing for more, trying to get more out of Biden in return, where they wouldn't have to give up too much. But then you have Zarif, who says, no, we can, kind of do a, deal for deal. So we can both re-enter and both be in compliance.
What are your thoughts on this? Because, again, from my reading, and I'm on the outside, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, it seems that what Ayatollah Khamenei has said, the supreme leader of Iran, versus what President Rouhani has said about the JCPOA seem like two different things. Am I correct in saying that?
Well, you can say that again. Actually, President Rouhani is trying to keep the door of diplomacy open. And I think that he is realistic enough to understand that, well, it's going to be a very tough way for the US and Biden to actually rejoin the JCPOA after Trump unilaterally withdrew from it. You know, the wall of mistrust is already tall between the two countries. There have been 4 decades of animosity and hostility between the two sides. So you cannot expect Biden or any other administration to resolve the issue within a couple of months. You know, President Rouhani is already in lame luck, and he is actually leaving office in less than a year. So I think that this is not going to happen overnight, and this will take a lot of time. You know, rebuilding the trust needs a lot of time. And remember, all of this happens after, you know, the assassination of Iran's top general Soleimani. You know, Trump assassinated Iran's most popular general, IRGC head, Quds Force head, General Qasem Soleimani, and he still has his blood on his hands. So you cannot expect Iranians to actually, settle the issue over a very short period of time. So I think that this is not very actually realistic, and President Rouhani knows that. He is just trying to, leave the door open for any possible talks for his much touted JCPOA.
Yeah.
And as the leader said, yes, there are 2 ways for Iran to actually continue the path. That is, one is lifting the sanctions, and the other one is just trying to get stronger so that, they cannot impose any more sanctions against you.
Reza, I wonder, the political realities on the ground in both countries, right, both the U.S. and Iran, will be quite interesting to watch right after Biden comes into office, right? Because right after he comes into office, it won't be very, very far off. The Iranian elections will not be very far off at that point in time. And certainly, I think that there's a greater issue within domestic Iranian politics of then the reformists versus the conservatives or the principalists, as they're known. Do you think it's a far gone conclusion now at this point that we'll have a more conservative government in Iran, and then that just makes any possibility of things snapping back to what they may have been before Trump that much harder?
I do believe that it is a foregone conclusion that we will have a principalist or a conservative as the next president of Iran, but we need to keep in mind that that doesn't really matter in the grand scheme when it comes to foreign policy dealings, because they're doing their bidding at the behest of, Khamenei. And what Abdul Hussein, mentioned, I do agree to a certain extent that it is not going to be easy, regardless. So we have 6 months left of a Rouhani presidency, and then after that, it just remains to be seen. But if we even look at these next 6 months, domestically, it is going to be difficult to kind of resell this deal to the Iranian people, but then also to the elites within Iran, within the Islamic Republic. And what you mentioned earlier about you have, Khamenei on one side speaking in certain tones, and then you have Rouhani speaking in different tones. That's nothing new when it comes to Iran's foreign policy dealings, because they do have to, work both bases, the left base and the right base in Iran. But getting to a deal, I think, is possible. Now, if that deal survives after Rouhani leaves office, that's a whole other question. And that's where my concern comes in. I don't see that deal really living a long life in Iran after Rouhani leaves. Now, there are ways around that, but even those seem to be far-fetched, because that would mean a lot of concessions on both sides, to where this is going to be a deal that goes beyond the JCPOA, and you're bringing in other types of issues that are of concern to Washington and to Tehran.
Habib, I'll give you the word before I let both of you go. On this issue then of the domestic situation in Iran, right? The goal has always been maximum pressure That's something that Pompeo and Donald Trump have used that term over and over again. Will maximum pressure, because right now, as we well know, the economic pressure on Iranians, and I'm talking about layman Iranians, is very, very hard right now. It's very severe. So will that then force Iranians to accept more concessions?
Well, I don't think so. Actually, if it were Donald Trump, well, you can say that maybe Iran had to find a way to negotiate. But Donald Trump is history now, and under Biden, Iranians are more demanding. You know, they're demanding compensation for actually the damages sanctions incur. They're demanding compensation for actually, withdrawing from the JCPOA. So I think regarding Ayatollah Khamenei's comments, before President Rouhani on Wednesday just talked about coming back to JCPOA. Well, Ayatollah Khamenei has already said that he is a revolutionary leader. He is not a diplomat. And I think that he is just trying to say that, he has not rejected any talks. He said that we tried lifting sanctions once through talks, and it didn't work. But I think he's trying to, the Iranian establishment is trying to stake out a stronger position in possible talks. You see, using this as a leverage, a pressure leverage. And that's a matter of who's going to take the first step. This is very important. For Iranians, they expect Biden to take the first step because that was the Americans who withdrew from the deal, not Iranians. So they need to make up for that and show goodwill gesture and take the first step. And that first step is very important. It depends to what extent and how much. And I think it would be a sort of step-by-step solution.
Very well. Reza, we really appreciate you both taking your time out of your busy schedules to share your expertise with us. That was Reza speaking to us from Washington and Habib speaking to us from the Iranian capital, Tehran. All four of our guests in this segment have spoken about Iran-U.S. relations, where they will head after Biden comes into office, because, obviously Donald Trump at this point is a lame duck. He may very well try to muddy the waters. There have been even rumors of Israel preparing for a possible war that the U.S. may wage on Iran, but those are all rumors at this point in time. That may or may not happen. We don't know what the coming days, weeks are to hold till Biden becomes the president of the United States on January 20th, I believe it is. Nevertheless, can we just snap back to a time before Trump? Can we just ignore what's happened during Trump's tenure? The assassination of Qasem Soleimani, Donald Trump walking away from the JCPOA altogether, the maximum pressure campaign, the horrible economic situation within Iran, as well as the grievances on the other side vis-a-vis Iranian activities in the region. Also, is it as simple as just snapping our fingers and wishing all of that away? I highly doubt that. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In the final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the UK and racism, institutional racism, more specifically within UK universities. A quarter, I should say, of ethnic minority students have said that they have experienced racial harassment in universities in the UK. According to the Universities UK, which is an organization that's published a report. It's called on senior leaders to admit when there are problems of racism at universities, saying that that is not currently happening at the level that it needs to be happening. All of this, of course, also comes after the Equalities Commission also had published a report into institutional racism within universities, not just, of course, towards students, but more specifically also towards academics, people of color within academia, etc. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. William Ackah, who is a senior lecturer in Black and Community Geographies at Birkbeck University of London. He is joining us today from London. William, thank you very much for taking your time out to speak to us here in Scope. What do you make of the report? I imagine these are not surprising statistics for yourself and others in academia. Nevertheless, how important is it to have it out there, and how optimistic are you that this will then be the impetus for change?
So on the one hand, I welcome the report, that at least it's trying to identify issues. But on the other hand, it's part of a pattern in British academia and wider society where reports are issued, but then no actions are taken So I think from our side, from the side of people of colour, we want to actually see the actions. Are institutions going to use the report to really tackle the deep-seated institutionalised racism that exists within these institutions?
Within the report, there are, of course, a whole bunch of recommendations and demands laid out. Do they go far enough?
I don't think so. I think given that what the report identifies, that the institutions themselves are institutionally racist, then I think that if these issues are structural, then we also need some structural solutions that involve real resources and money, not just more, if you like, data collecting and data monitoring, which the report seems to be implying and suggesting. I welcome the fact that they're calling on the leadership of institutions to take more accountability. I welcome the fact that they want to engage in curriculum change. But as I say, I think what I would like to see more in the report is actually strategic actions, is putting resources into schemes that will empower people of colour to achieve their goals within higher education.
Just for our viewers' sake, William, it's sometimes on the outside, looking from the outside in, it's hard to completely contextualize how bad the situation is within academia. In your experience and the experience that you know of others around you, what have been the problems? I mean, what have been the major red flags vis-a-vis institutional racism?
Yeah, so we can take it from every level. So at the level of the students of colour are less likely to get a good degree in university, in the gateway to a job. They're less likely to get funded scholarships and funded places to do postgraduate work. At the level of staff, out of the highest academic role is the professor. So out of, I think they're currently say around 18 to 20,000 professors in Britain. And there are less than 100 of those that are black. So these issues are deep-seated and embedded. We think about the leadership of the universities. There are probably less than 10 of the vice-chancellors are people of colour in these institutions, probably less than 5, actually. So it shows that these issues go right from the student experience right to the leadership, that they run right the way through these the institutional spaces. That, in a sense, what we have in a situation in these universities is, in a sense, is white leaders, white academics, white professors passing on or imparting their wisdom, if you like, to people of colour, but people of colour not really being in a position to influence change or to really be able to be their full and authentic selves within these institutional spaces.
So then what needs to happen, and pardon my ignorance on this, but is it a question of having then a quota system put in place? I mean, is it a question of numbers here that we want to see higher for then the proper influence and the proper discussions to be happening, or is it not a question of numbers, but just a question of not being heard?
I think it's a mixture of both. That there's certainly a need for positive action that then results in more people of colour being in the leadership of the institutions. But then there's also the broader notion of cultural change. These institutions are positioning themselves as global brands, which in a sense is why you brought me onto the program, that their reach is global. They're gathering students from all across the world. So in that regards, then they should be treating those students, treating those academics with dignity and equality. So in that regards, that's a cultural shift as well, changing some of the curriculum, changing some of the teaching and learning methods, and really seeing these students, people of colour from around the world, as assets that enhance their institutions rather than problems that need to be dealt with and tackled.
All right, so then is a question, I'm going to ask you a two-pronged question there, because, you know, we are in the midst of course, the Brexit process, and we've all known the kinds of rhetoric that was used, at least right before the referendum, and even right after in many ways, and until now, vis-a-vis people of color, et cetera, and migration as a whole. And then we've had, you know, the entire scandal with the Windrush generation as well. And none of the above really gives one a lot of confidence. Is that fair to say in what may happen going forward?
Yes, I would agree with that, that given the current government's arrangements, as you say, with Brexit, with the Windrush scandal and other scandals, you don't really have confidence that institutions are really willing to change. Where we might see hope is that with the Black Lives Matter movement and the numbers of people from all different backgrounds that came out to support that movement, that there's at least at the ground level, there's a groundswell that your ordinary people, young people, want to see change. And if they keep pushing, along with allies that also want to see change, that is maybe where the change is going to happen. But the institutions by themselves are not going to change just because they think it's a good thing. They have to be pressurized into making those changes. And I think Black Lives Matter has been part of that protest and push for change that are making universities, as well as other institutions in Britain, museums, cultural institutions, look at their history and recognize that they need to change. So I think that is where the hope lies. And the fact that people like yourselves are putting an international spotlight on these issues, again, hopefully, universities conscious of their global brand and that this is damaging them as global institutions will seek then to make the changes necessary.
Indeed. There that, William, but we do sincerely appreciate you taking your time out of a busy schedule to share your expertise with us. That was William Ackah speaking to us there from London, speaking about the university's UK report that has come out pretty much on the heels of the Equalities Commission report as well. It was delayed, I believe, as well, this report. It does include a number of recommendations vis-a-vis what should happen, but as William there said, the critics have also very clearly laid out that those recommendations don't actually go far enough at this point in time, at least. What does need to happen? I mean, a lot of people of color would love to go to countries like the UK to study higher education. Is the UK then becoming a place where, which is discouraging, in fact, people of color to come take part in both academia as well as other facets of society, which it vitally, in fact, needs more migrants to come in, especially considering Brexit and, you know, the very fatalistic forecasts that Brexit may bring about, may come into the reality. So as William there said, you know, there needs to be an appreciation of what people of color bring to the table, both as professors, as students, and otherwise within academia. And there needs to be an understanding that it won't be the institutions themselves that will necessarily bring about change, but it'll be the international community possibly pressuring the UK to do the right thing. And also, of course, the government needs to enact proper regulations in those regards as well. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.